And honestly, I don't think Maya would have gotten this promotion without me making a few calls, Aunt Linda said, her voice carrying across the backyard with that particular tone of false modesty that made my stomach clench. And I stood there frozen next to the potato salad table, holding my paper plate so tightly I could feel it starting to buckle under my fingers. I had arrived at the family BBQ 20 minutes earlier, had been making my rounds saying hello to cousins and uncles I hadn't seen since Christmas. And now here was Linda surrounded by my relatives near the grill, telling them about my promotion to regional director at TechCore Industries, like she had orchestrated the entire thing. I put in a good word with some people I know there, she continued, waving her hand dismissively as if calling in favors at major corporations was just something she did casually between her shifts managing the front desk at a dental office. Maya's a sweet girl, works hard, but you know how competitive these things are. Sometimes you need someone to advocate for you, to make sure the right people know your name. My cousin Rachel nodded sympathetically, and I watched Uncle Mike pat Linda on the shoulder like she was some kind of fairy godmother. And the familiar hot shame washed over me, the same feeling I'd had 100 times before when Linda did this, when she took something that belonged entirely to me and claimed it as partially hers, as if my accomplishments were joint ventures we'd undertaken together rather than achievements I'd earned through 6 years of 80-hour weeks and projects that kept me awake at night and presentations I'd rehearsed until my voice went hoarse. Linda didn't know anyone at TechCore Industries. Linda had never set foot inside TechCore's building. Linda hadn't seen my supply chain optimization proposal, or watched me lead cross-functional team meetings, or stayed late helping integrate the new logistics software that would save the company $2.3 million annually, the project that had actually earned me this promotion, from operations manager to regional director, overseeing 7 states and more than 200 employees, with a salary increase from $78,000 to $145,000 that represented not Linda's phone calls, but my own merit, my own innovation, my own grinding dedication to excellence. But here she was, rewriting history again the way she'd been doing since I was a child, and I stood there next to the potato salad, watching her steal my achievement in real time. Watching my family believe her because they always believed her. Because Linda had positioned herself as my benefactor so long ago that everyone just accepted it as truth. And the worst part was the smile on her face, so warm and proud, as if she genuinely believed she deserved credit for a promotion she had absolutely nothing to do with. And I felt 17 years old again, small and powerless and invisible, even though I was 29 and successful, and should have been capable of walking over there and correcting the record. But I didn't. I just stood there holding my plate, silent as always. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. This wasn't the first time Linda had rewritten my history, and standing there watching her perform for my relatives, I felt the weight of 17 years of this pattern, a pattern that started when I was 12 years old, and my mother died of an aneurysm on a Tuesday morning in March, gone so suddenly that I didn't get to say goodbye, and in the aftermath of that loss when my father retreated into himself and became a ghost in our own house, Linda stepped in and positioned herself as my savior, my guide, the woman who would fill the impossible void my mother left behind. I remembered being 14 and getting my acceptance letter to Riverside Academy, the magnet school for advanced students that required an entrance exam I'd studied for all summer, practicing math problems until my hands cramped and reading comprehension passages until the words blurred together. And when I got in with a score in the 97th percentile, Linda told everyone at that year's 4th of July party that she'd called in a favor with a friend on the admissions board, that Maya was bright but needed a little help getting noticed. And I'd stood there just like I was standing now, silent and small, while adults congratulated Linda on her connections and her generosity. 4 years later, when I got a full academic scholarship to State University, Linda claimed she'd helped me with my essay, had edited it extensively, had shaped my application strategy, when the truth was, I'd written 17 drafts of that essay alone in my bedroom, had researched scholarship requirements on my own, had submitted everything without Linda reading a single word, because she'd been on a cruise with her husband the month applications were due. Then came my junior year internship at Morrison Consulting, a competitive position I'd gotten through my professor's recommendation after I'd earned the highest grade in his econometrics class, but Linda told the family she'd connected me with someone who knew someone, creating phantom networks of influence that existed only in her imagination, and by then the pattern was so established that no one questioned it. They just accepted that Linda was the reason for my success, that without her intervention, I would be ordinary instead of accomplished, struggling instead of thriving. My mother's death had left me vulnerable in ways I didn't understand at 12, desperate for female guidance and approval, and Linda had filled that space but twisted it into something that served her, transforming herself from my aunt into my supposed benefactor, the person who made things happen for poor Maya, who'd lost her mother and had a checked-out father and needed someone to open doors she couldn't open herself. The cruelest part was that Linda seemed to believe her own stories after a while, seemed to genuinely think she'd contributed to achievements that were entirely mine, as if her proximity to me during those years somehow entitled her to partial credit, as if being present in my life while I worked myself to exhaustion meant she deserved recognition for the outcomes of that work. And my father never corrected her because he was barely present enough to know what was true and what wasn't, and the rest of the family just accepted Linda's narrative because she told it so confidently and so consistently that it became family lore. The story of how Linda helped Maya succeed after her sister died, a heartwarming tale of aunt stepping up for niece, except it was all a lie, and I'd spent 17 years living inside that lie, watching Linda steal pieces of my identity one achievement at a time. I forced myself to move away from the potato salad table, to circulate through the backyard like everything was normal, like I hadn't just heard my aunt claim credit for the biggest achievement of my career, and the June sun beat down on my uncle's lawn where 40-something family members had gathered for the annual summer BBQ, kids running through a sprinkler near the fence, the smell of hamburgers and hot dogs on the grill, coolers full of beer and soda sweating in the heat, folding tables covered with plastic checkered tablecloths, holding pasta salads and baked beans and corn on the cob, everything casual and warm and summery, the kind of family gathering that should have felt safe and celebratory. But I moved through it like I was underwater, sounds muffled and distant, because everywhere I went, I heard fragments of Linda's story spreading like a virus through my family. I passed the picnic table where she was talking to my cousin Beth and Beth's husband, and Linda was saying, "I called my friend Jennifer who works in HR there. Well, not at TechCore exactly, but she knows people, and I told her Maya really deserved a chance at this level." And Beth was nodding like this made perfect sense. Like Linda having phantom friends in phantom HR departments was completely credible. And I kept walking toward the drink cooler, my face hot with something that wasn't the sun. Near the garage, I heard her telling Uncle Pete, Maya needed someone to vouch for her character. You know how corporate politics work, and I made sure the right people understood what kind of person she is. As if my character had been in question. As if 6 years of exemplary performance reviews and successful projects and team leadership somehow hadn't communicated my character sufficiently. As if I'd needed Linda to call some imaginary contact and confirm that yes, Maya is trustworthy. Maya is capable. You can safely promote Maya now that her aunt has provided references. I grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and stood there gripping it, the cold plastic burning my palm, watching Linda move through my family like a politician working a room, touching arms and laughing and accepting praise for my accomplishments, and the anger built in my chest like pressure behind a dam. But it was tangled up with old patterns and old fears. The ingrained certainty that contradicting Linda would make me ungrateful, would make me the bad guy, would shatter the family harmony everyone else seemed to value more than truth. I'd been silent for 17 years, and silence had become my default setting. Easier than confrontation, easier than making scenes, easier than being seen as difficult or bitter or jealous, because that's how Linda would frame it if I challenged her. She'd paint me as resentful and small-minded, unable to accept help graciously, and part of me wondered if people would believe her version over mine, because they'd been believing her for so long that her narrative had calcified into accepted history, and fighting that felt like trying to push back against concrete that had already set. 3 weeks earlier, I'd sat in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of TechCore Industries' headquarters building in downtown Seattle. The city skyline stretching out behind David Chen as he slid a folder across the polished table toward me, and he'd said, "Maya, we'd like to offer you the position of Regional Director for the Western Division." And for a moment, I couldn't process the words because I'd been preparing myself for a routine quarterly review, not a promotion that would change everything. The Western Division covered 7 states, oversaw 237 employees across 12 regional offices, and managed supply chain operations that represented 43% of TechCore's total North American revenue, and David was telling me it was mine, that the executive committee had voted unanimously to promote me after reviewing my performance over the past 18 months, and particularly after the results of the supply chain optimization project I'd led since January. That project had consumed my life for 6 months, 80-hour weeks spent analyzing transportation routes and vendor contracts and warehouse efficiency metrics, building predictive models and running scenario analyses, and convincing stakeholders across 4 departments to completely restructure systems they'd been using for a decade, and I'd done it while managing my existing responsibilities as Senior Operations Manager, arriving at the office at 6:30 in the morning and leaving after 8 at night, working weekends, skipping lunches, perfecting every presentation and triple-checking every data point because I knew this project was my chance to prove I could operate at a strategic level instead of just a tactical one. The innovation had been mine, the solution of implementing a hybrid distribution model that consolidated regional warehouses while maintaining rapid delivery times through algorithmic route optimization. And when I'd presented it to the executive committee in April, my hands had shaken holding the clicker, but my voice had stayed steady as I walked them through 73 slides of analysis and projections, and they'd approved the pilot program, and by May the results were undeniable. We'd reduced transportation costs by 18%, improved delivery times by 12%, and the annual savings were projected at $2.3 million. Numbers that David now referenced as he explained that this kind of transformational thinking was exactly what TechCore needed in its leadership. The salary increase from $78,000 to $145,000 felt surreal, nearly doubling my income, and finally putting me in a financial position where I could buy a house instead of renting my 1-bedroom apartment. And David told me I'd earned it through demonstrated excellence in innovation and leadership, that my team respected me and my peers valued my collaboration, and the executives trusted my judgment. And sitting there listening to him detail my own accomplishments felt strange because I'd spent so long just putting my head down and working that I hadn't fully recognized how far I'd come or how much I'd achieved. This promotion was mine, earned through 6 years of proving myself at TechCore, through countless projects and presentations and problems solved, through expertise I'd built methodically and skills I'd developed deliberately, and no one had made a phone call on my behalf or vouched for my character or opened a door I couldn't open myself. And that truth mattered more than I'd realized until I heard Linda trying to steal it. I was standing near the grill trying to look occupied with arranging hamburger buns when my cousin Jenna found me, her blonde ponytail swinging as she navigated around a cluster of kids playing cornhole, and she pulled me into a quick hug that smelled like sunscreen and white wine, saying, "Congratulations on the promotion, Maya. That's so amazing." Her smile genuine and warm in a way that made my chest tighten, because she had no idea she was congratulating me for something Linda had stolen, and I opened my mouth to tell her the truth, to explain that Linda had nothing to do with my promotion, that I'd earned it entirely on my own. But before I could form the words, Jenna continued, Linda always comes through for family, doesn't she? I swear, I don't know what we'd do without her connections. And the praise for Linda twisted something sharp in my stomach, and I started to say, actually, Jenna, Linda didn't. But Linda materialized beside us like she had radar for moments when her narrative might be challenged, her hand landing on Jenna's elbow as she said brightly, Jenna, honey, your mom is looking for you over by the dessert table, something about the birthday cake. And Jenna squeezed my arm once more and said, we'll catch up later, before letting Linda guide her away. And I stood there with my correction dying in my throat, watching Linda redirect Jenna with the practiced ease of someone who'd been controlling narratives for decades. I turned back toward the grill, and that's when I noticed Marcus, my 16-year-old cousin, standing a few feet away near the cooler with a hot dog on his plate, and he was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something thoughtful and uncomfortable. And our eyes met for a second before he looked away. But I got the distinct impression he'd witnessed that entire exchange, had seen Linda intercept and redirect Jenna, had maybe even understood what he was seeing. My hands were shaking slightly as I picked up my plate from where I'd set it on the folding chair nearby, the paper plate wobbling and making the potato salad slide toward the edge. And I realized I was at a decision point, one of those moments that feels small, but carries enormous weight, where I could either speak up and break a 17-year pattern, or stay silent and let Linda's lie cement itself as family truth. The anger was still building in my chest, but it was competing with fear and old conditioning, the ingrained certainty that challenging Linda would make me the problem, would disrupt family harmony, would mark me as ungrateful and difficult. And I thought about all the times I'd stayed quiet, every achievement she'd claimed, and every correction I'd swallowed. The cumulative weight of silence that had become so heavy I'd stopped noticing I was carrying it. I was 29 years old, a regional director managing millions of dollars in operations and leading a team of more than 200 people. I made strategic decisions that affected TechCore's entire Western division. But standing in my uncle's backyard, surrounded by family, I couldn't seem to manage the simple act of saying, "That's not true," out loud. And the realization made me feel small and angry and ashamed all at once. Angry at Linda for lying, but more angry at myself for allowing it, for enabling it through years of silence that had made her believe she could claim anything, and I'd never contradict her. And maybe she was right, because here I was again, watching her work the crowd with my stolen accomplishment. And I wasn't doing anything to stop it. I remembered my college graduation 6 years earlier with painful clarity, the memory surfacing now like it had been waiting for this moment. That May morning when I'd walked across the stage at the University of Washington in my cap and gown to receive my degree in supply chain management, graduating summa cum laude with a 3.94 GPA that represented 4 years of relentless effort. And I'd scanned the crowd in the stadium seating, looking for my father's face, and found him sitting with Linda. And after the ceremony when we'd gathered for the family lunch at Anthony's on the waterfront, Linda had held court at our table for 8, telling my father's colleagues and distant relatives who'd made the trip that she'd helped me so much with my studies, that she'd tutored me through those difficult business classes, that I couldn't have done it without her support. And I'd sat there in my graduation dress picking at my salmon and saying nothing while she constructed a narrative where my academic success was somehow her accomplishment. The truth was that Linda hadn't tutored me through anything, had never once helped with homework or reviewed a paper or explained a concept, and in fact I couldn't remember her ever asking about my classes, except in the most superficial way, the kind of "how's school" question you ask while already turning away because you don't actually want an answer. And she certainly hadn't attended Parents' Weekend any of the 4 years I was at UW, even though she lived only 45 minutes away in Tacoma, hadn't come to see my dorm room or meet my professors or watch me present my senior capstone project. But now at my graduation lunch, she was claiming credit for the 3.94 GPA I'd earned while working two part-time jobs to supplement my scholarship. The 20-hour weeks I'd spent shelving books at the campus library and waiting tables at a breakfast place near Greek Row. The late nights I'd spent studying after exhausting shifts. The way I'd learned to write papers between customers and memorize formulas on the bus. I'd graduated summa cum laude through my own discipline and intelligence and relentless work ethic, and Linda's contribution had been exactly nothing. But listening to her at that graduation lunch, I'd watched my father nod along with her story, watched him thank her for being there for Maya, watched our relatives absorb her version as truth, and I'd realized that Linda had been constructing this narrative throughout my entire college experience. Little comments to family members over the years that built up to this moment, where she could claim partial credit for my degree. And the worst part was how readily everyone accepted it, how natural it seemed to them that Linda would be my benefactor and supporter, how easily they believed she'd earned some share of my accomplishment. That pattern of theft had started long before college, I knew, had probably begun when my mother died, and Linda stepped into the vacuum and discovered she could claim anything she wanted about her relationship with me because I was too young and too grief-stricken and too desperate for maternal presence to contradict her. But the graduation lunch was when I'd fully understood what she was doing, when I'd recognized it as a deliberate pattern rather than isolated incidents. And I'd still said nothing, had still let her narrative stand unchallenged, and that silence had apparently taught her she could take anything from me without consequence. I was standing by the dessert table pretending to examine the array of pies and cookies when my father appeared at my side. His gray polo shirt slightly wrinkled and his reading glasses hanging from a lanyard around his neck, the way they always did at casual gatherings. And he was smiling in that distant way he'd perfected over the years, present but not quite engaged, and he said, "Maya, honey, congratulations again on the promotion," which should have warmed me, but instead made my stomach clench because I knew what was coming next, and sure enough he continued, "I wanted to thank Linda for helping you out. She really came through again, didn't she?" And he was already turning away from me as he spoke, already seeking Linda out in the crowd, and I watched him cross the patio toward where she stood near the grill talking to Uncle Robert, watched him tap her shoulder and lean in to speak to her, watched her face light up with pleased surprise as my father said something I couldn't hear from this distance, but could easily imagine. And I saw her hand fly to her chest in that false modest gesture she'd perfected, saw her shake her head like she didn't deserve thanks, while clearly basking in it. And something cracked open inside my chest, watching my father. The one person who should defend me and champion me and know the truth of my capabilities, praising Linda for an accomplishment that was entirely mine. And I realized this was the pattern that had enabled Linda all these years. Not just my silence, but his acceptance, his ready belief that I needed help and intervention and connections because I couldn't possibly succeed on my own merit. And the pain of that realization was sharp and clarifying, cutting through 17 years of accumulated hurt to show me the core of the problem, which wasn't just Linda's theft, but my family's willingness to believe I was someone who needed that kind of help in the first place. I set down the paper plate I'd been clutching, my appetite completely gone, and I walked quickly toward the house, needing space and air and distance from the backyard where my father was thanking my aunt for my own achievement. And I pushed through the sliding glass door into the blessed air-conditioned quiet of Uncle Robert's living room, navigated past the kids' video game setup in the den, and locked myself in the powder room near the kitchen, the small space with its seashell-themed decor and wicker basket of fancy hand towels suddenly feeling like a sanctuary. And I stood at the sink with my hands braced on the granite counter and looked at myself in the mirror, really looked at myself, at the 29-year-old woman in the coral sundress with her dark hair pulled back in a clip and her mother's eyes looking back at her, and I thought, I'm done. I'm done staying silent, I'm done letting Linda steal my accomplishments, and I'm done letting my family believe I'm someone who needs that kind of intervention, and the decision felt monumental and terrifying and absolutely necessary. though I had no idea how to actually break a pattern that had 17 years of momentum behind it. I gave myself what I supposed could be called a pep talk, speaking quietly to my reflection in the mirror, reminding myself that I was a regional director at TechCore Industries, that I managed operations across 7 states and led a team of more than 200 people, that I'd saved my company $2.3 million annually through innovation and strategic thinking, that I made decisions every single day that affected millions of dollars in revenue and hundreds of employees' livelihoods. And if I could handle that level of responsibility and pressure, then surely I could handle one family barbecue and one confrontation with my aunt. And the reasoning was sound, but it didn't quite account for the way family dynamics operate on a different level than professional competence, the way old patterns can make you 12 years old again, no matter how successful you've become. But I straightened my shoulders and smoothed my dress and unlocked the bathroom door anyway. Walking back through the house toward the sliding glass door, with my heart hammering and my hands steady and absolutely no plan for what I was going to say or do, knowing only that I was finished being silent. I stepped back through the sliding glass door into the afternoon heat and immediately spotted Linda holding court on the stone patio near the outdoor fireplace, and my heart sank because she'd gathered an even larger audience this time, my grandmother sitting in one of the cushioned wicker chairs with her cane propped against the armrest, Uncle Tom standing with his arms crossed and a beer in hand, Uncle Robert flipping burgers at the grill but clearly listening, and at least 5 or 6 cousins in a semicircle around Linda, who stood at the center gesturing animatedly with her wine glass. And I could hear her voice carrying across the yard over the classic rock playing from the speakers, that confident storytelling tone she used when she knew she had people's attention, and I moved closer along the edge of the patio trying to hear what version of the story she was telling now, and I caught the words, "So I called the CEO directly," and my stomach dropped because she was escalating, embellishing further, and Uncle Tom said, "You know the CEO of TechCore Industries?" with genuine surprise in his voice, and Linda waved her hand dismissively and said, "Well, we've been in touch over the years. I helped place someone there a while back, and we've maintained the relationship," which was such a complete fabrication that I felt dizzy with anger and disbelief, and my grandmother was nodding along looking impressed and proud. And Linda continued, "So when Maya's promotion was being considered, I just picked up the phone and had a conversation, vouched for her character and work ethic, and I think that really made the difference in their decision." And I was walking toward the group now without consciously deciding to move, my sandals clicking on the stone pavers, my hands clenched at my sides, and I was opening my mouth to speak, though I still had no idea what I was going to say. But before I could form words, Linda spotted me approaching, and her face lit up with that warm aunt smile that I'd once found comforting and now recognized as performance. And she called out, "Maya, sweetheart, come here. We're just talking about your wonderful promotion." And she reached out to me as I got close, putting her arm around my shoulders and pulling me into the circle next to her, her grip firm and proprietary, and she was still talking. "I was just telling everyone about my call to the CEO and how TechCore is lucky to have you." And she squeezed my shoulder and looked at me with that expectant expression I knew so well, and she said in that particular tone that was somehow both warm and commanding, "Tell them how grateful you are, sweetheart. Tell them what it means to have family support like this." And I stood there frozen under the weight of her arm and the attention of my entire family, my grandmother looking at me with love and pride that was based on a complete lie, my uncles waiting for me to confirm Linda's story, my cousins watching with expressions ranging from genuine happiness to something that might have been skepticism, and I felt the old pattern pulling at me like gravity, the ingrained habit of silence and accommodation, and my mouth opened but nothing came out. And Linda was still smiling at me, waiting for my gratitude and compliance, and I could feel the moment stretching out, becoming awkward. And then a voice spoke from somewhere behind the circle of family members, a male voice I recognized instantly, though I couldn't quite believe I was hearing it here. And the voice said calm and clear, and with an edge of steel underneath the politeness, "That's interesting, Linda, because I'm the one who promoted Maya." Everyone turned as if choreographed, heads swiveling toward the voice that had come from behind the semicircle of family members, and I felt Linda's arms stiffen around my shoulders as the crowd parted slightly to reveal David Chen standing there in khaki shorts and a crisp white polo shirt, holding a sweating bottle of Corona with a lime wedge visible in the neck. And he was smiling that polite professional smile I'd seen him use in tense contract negotiations, the smile that looked friendly, but had absolutely no warmth behind it, and my brain couldn't process what I was seeing because David was my boss, the vice president of operations at TechCore Industries, the man who had sat across from me in the 8th floor conference room 3 weeks ago and offered me the regional director position, and he was standing in my Uncle Robert's backyard at a family barbecue looking directly at Linda with that steel-edged smile, and I realized with a shock that felt like ice water down my spine that he'd actually come, that weeks ago, when I'd extended what I'd thought was a purely courtesy invitation, mentioning casually that my family was having a summer gathering and he was welcome to stop by if he happened to be in the area, since I knew he lived only about 20 minutes from my uncle's house. I had never actually expected him to take me up on it, had assumed it was one of those polite gestures that professionals make without any real expectation of follow-through. But here he was, and from the slightly damp look of his hair and the fresh sunscreen smell I could detect even from several feet away, he'd probably come straight from doing something outdoorsy with his family, maybe the kayaking he'd mentioned he liked to do on weekends. And he'd actually made the effort to stop by my family barbecue. And now he was standing here having clearly heard at least part of Linda's elaborate fiction about calling the CEO. Linda's face had gone through a remarkable transformation in the space of about 3 seconds, first going completely white like someone had drained all the blood from her head, then flushing a deep red that started at her neck and climbed up to her cheeks, and her arm dropped from my shoulders as if I'd suddenly become electrified, and she was staring at David with her mouth slightly open, and I could see her brain working frantically behind her eyes, trying to figure out who this man was and how much he'd heard, and whether there was any way to salvage the situation, and my grandmother was looking confused. Her elderly face creased with the effort of understanding what was happening, and Uncle Tom had straightened up from his casual lean, his beer bottle frozen halfway to his mouth, and all my cousins were dead silent. And the entire patio had gone so quiet that I could hear the classic rock station playing from the speakers near the grill, some Eagles song about taking it easy, and the contrast between the laid-back music and the sudden tension in the air was so stark it felt almost absurd. And I realized I was holding my breath, and David was still standing there with that polite, dangerous smile, waiting for someone to respond to his statement. And the moment stretched out long enough that it became excruciating. And finally Linda found her voice, though it came out higher and thinner than her usual confident tone. Linda let out a laugh that sounded brittle and forced, nothing like her usual confident tone, and she said, "Oh, well, hello there. I didn't realize Maya had invited colleagues. How nice." And she was already trying to recover, to find her footing, and David stepped forward into the circle with an easy confidence that came from 25 years of managing difficult business situations. And he extended his hand first to my grandmother and said, "I'm David Chen, Vice President of Operations at TechCore Industries. I work with Maya." And my grandmother shook his hand, looking bewildered by this sudden turn of events. And David went around the circle, introducing himself to Uncle Tom and Uncle Robert, and each of my cousins with the same professional courtesy he used in client meetings. And I could see Linda's mind working frantically trying to figure out her next move. And when David had finished his introductions and the attention came back to her, she laughed again and waved her wine glass in a dismissive gesture and said, "Oh, I think there's been a little misunderstanding. I meant that I recommended Maya through unofficial channels. You know how these things work, networking and connections. I have a friend who knows someone on the board." And her voice had that same smooth, confident quality she always used when lying, but I could hear the slight tremor underneath it. And David took a sip of his Corona and said with perfect politeness that somehow felt more cutting than open hostility, "Actually, I don't know how that works, because that's not how we do hiring and promotions at TechCore." And he looked directly at Linda with those dark eyes that I'd seen make senior directors squirm during budget reviews. And he continued, Maya earned this promotion entirely on her own merit through 6 years of exceptional performance. And I've never spoken to you before this moment, and I certainly haven't spoken to anyone on our board about you. And the word you carried just the slightest emphasis that made it clear exactly what he thought of Linda's claims. And the silence that fell over the patio was different from the earlier silence. It was heavier and more uncomfortable, and I could feel my face burning with a mixture of mortification at having my family dysfunction exposed in front of my boss, and a strange relief that someone was finally calling Linda out. And my grandmother was looking between David and Linda with growing confusion, and Uncle Tom had lowered his beer bottle completely and was staring at Linda with an expression I couldn't quite read, and my cousins were shifting their weight and exchanging glances, and I could see the exact moment when the atmosphere shifted from celebration to something else entirely, something that felt like the air before a thunderstorm. And Linda opened her mouth to say something else, but David wasn't finished, and he said still in that perfectly polite tone that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. Maya's promotion was based on her leadership of a cross-functional team that redesigned our entire supply chain management system, her innovative approach to vendor relations, and the $2.3 million in annual savings she generated for the company. And the decision was made by myself and our executive team based solely on her documented performance over 6 years. And I felt tears prick at my eyes because someone was finally saying out loud what I'd accomplished. Someone was finally telling my family the truth. And Linda's face had gone from red to a blotchy combination of white and red. And she said, well, I was speaking more generally about family support, about being there for Maya. And David said, were you? And let the question hang in the air. And my grandmother said in her wavering, elderly voice, Linda, did you actually help Maya get this job or not? And the directness of the question from the family matriarch seemed to strip away Linda's ability to deflect. And everyone was looking at her waiting for an answer, and I stood there feeling like I was watching my entire family dynamic rearrange itself in real time. Linda was still trying to formulate an answer to my grandmother's direct question when David spoke again, and this time he shifted his body language slightly, turning more toward the gathered family members rather than addressing Linda directly, and his tone became less confrontational and more conversational, almost educational, like he was giving a presentation to stakeholders who genuinely wanted to understand a complex project. And he said, I think it's important that Maya's family understands exactly what she accomplished to earn this promotion, because from what I've overheard today, it seems like there's been some confusion about how this came about. And he took another sip of his Corona and continued. Maya joined TechCore 6 years ago as a supply chain analyst, entry-level position, and within 18 months, she'd identified inefficiencies in our vendor management system that none of our senior analysts had caught. And I felt my face getting hot because I'd never talked about my work in detail with my family, had never wanted to seem like I was bragging, had learned early that talking about my achievements only gave Linda more material to later claim as her own influence. And David kept talking, describing how I'd proposed a complete redesign of how we selected and managed relationships with our parts suppliers. How I'd built a scoring system that evaluated vendors on 12 different metrics instead of just focusing on price, and my Uncle Tom was actually listening intently now, his engineer's brain clearly engaged by the technical details, and David explained how my system had reduced our defect rates by 43% in the first year while also cutting costs. And he mentioned the cross-functional team I'd led, 7 people from different departments, including some who had 15 years more experience than me, and how I'd navigated the political complexities of getting buy-in from department heads who were initially resistant to changing established processes. And my cousin Jenna was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. And David described the presentation I'd given to the executive leadership team, the one I'd rehearsed 40 times until I could deliver it perfectly without notes, the one that had addressed every possible objection before it could be raised. And he told them about the pilot program in our Ohio facilities, how I'd personally traveled to 3 different plants over 2 months to oversee implementation and train the local teams. And I remembered those trips, the early mornings and late nights, the patient explaining of new procedures to skeptical warehouse managers who had been doing things the same way for 20 years, the way I'd gradually won them over by listening to their concerns and incorporating their practical knowledge into the system design. And David was saying, the Ohio pilot was so successful that we rolled the program out across all our North American operations. And that's when we started seeing the real cost savings, 2.3 million annually, and that's a conservative estimate. And Maya managed that entire rollout while still handling her regular analyst responsibilities. And my grandmother was looking at me with wide eyes like she couldn't quite reconcile this description with her understanding of who I was. And David continued explaining how I'd been promoted to senior analyst after 3 years, then to supply chain manager after another 2, and how in that management role I'd supervised a team of 12 people and maintained a department retention rate of 96% in an industry where people job hop constantly. And he said, Maya's team members consistently rate her as the best manager they've ever had. And when I talk to them about why, they mention her ability to develop their skills, her clear communication, and the fact that she gives credit where it's due and takes responsibility when things go wrong. And that last phrase felt pointed given the current situation with Linda, and David had been talking for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 2 minutes, and he wrapped up by saying, so when the regional director position opened up 3 weeks ago, Maya was the obvious choice, the only choice really, because she'd already proven she could handle complex operations, lead diverse teams, and deliver measurable results. And she'll be overseeing 7 states and more than 200 employees. And I have complete confidence in her ability to excel in this role because she's earned every step of this advancement through her own merit. And when he finished, there was a moment of silence where everyone seemed to be processing everything they'd just heard, and I realized that my family had never known any of this, had never heard what I actually did all day, had never understood the scope of my responsibilities or the significance of my achievements, and I felt simultaneously exposed and validated, mortified that it had taken my boss showing up at a family barbecue to tell them the truth, but also deeply grateful that someone had finally said it out loud. Linda's mouth opened, as if she was about to interrupt David's detailed recounting of my accomplishments, and she held up her wine glass in a gesture that was probably meant to look casual but came across as desperate, and she said with that laugh that sounded increasingly hollow, well, I think what I meant was more about moral support. You know, family support, being there for Maya emotionally during difficult times. And she was trying to pivot the conversation towards something she could reasonably claim, trying to reframe her earlier lies as some kind of misunderstanding about what helping meant. But David didn't let her finish the thought, and he turned to look directly at her with an expression that was still perfectly polite on the surface, but had something harder underneath. And he said in that same measured tone he'd been using, that's interesting that you mention being supportive, because Maya actually told me something different. And I felt my stomach drop because I suddenly realized where he was going with this, and I wanted to stop him, but I also desperately wanted him to continue, and he went on. When Maya accepted the regional director position, we had a conversation about the challenges she'd face in the role, and I asked her about her support system, about who in her life she could rely on during stressful times. And everyone was listening intently now, including Linda, whose face had gone very still, and David continued. Maya told me that she'd accomplished everything in her career while dealing with family members who consistently undermined her confidence and took credit for her work. And she said it so matter-of-factly, like it was just a normal thing she'd learned to work around. And I remember being shocked that anyone's family could be that unsupportive. And he paused and took a sip of his Corona, letting the words sink in. And then he said, looking around at all the gathered relatives, I told Maya I found that hard to believe, that surely her family must be proud of her and supportive of her achievements, because how could anyone take credit for work they didn't do, for accomplishments they had no part in earning? And his eyes settled back on Linda, and he said with devastating simplicity, I guess I was wrong about that. And the silence that fell over the patio was different from any silence that had come before. It was the kind of silence that feels like the air has been sucked out of a room, nuclear and complete and unbearable, and I stood there feeling like my skin was on fire, mortified that David had shared something I'd told him in confidence, humiliated that my family dysfunction was being laid bare in front of everyone, but also feeling something else underneath the embarrassment, something that felt like validation, like relief, like someone had finally said out loud what I'd been carrying silently for 17 years, and I couldn't look at anyone, couldn't meet my grandmother's eyes or my father's or Linda's, and I could feel tears threatening at the corners of my eyes, but I absolutely refused to cry right now, and Linda was making a sound like she was trying to form words but couldn't quite get them out, and my Uncle Tom had set his beer down completely and was staring at Linda with an expression I'd never seen him wear before, something between disappointment and anger. And my cousin Jenna had her hand over her mouth looking back and forth between me and Linda, like pieces of a puzzle were suddenly clicking into place in her mind, and my grandmother said in her wavering voice that somehow carried across the entire patio, "Linda, is this true?" And the question hung there demanding an answer that everyone knew was yes. Linda opened her mouth and closed it again, her face cycling through expressions so quickly it would have been almost comical if the moment weren't so excruciating. And she started to say something, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper against my grandmother's question that still hung in the air, and Uncle Tom set down his plate on the nearby patio table with a deliberate movement and turned to face Linda directly, and he said in a voice I'd never heard him use before, measured and serious and deeply disappointed, "Linda, did you actually do anything to help Maya get this promotion? Yes or no?" And the question was so direct and simple that there was no way to deflect from it. And Linda's eyes darted around the gathered family members like she was looking for an escape route or an ally, and she said with her voice getting higher and more strained, "I don't appreciate being attacked like this at a family gathering. This is supposed to be a celebration, and you're all turning it into an interrogation." And she was trying to make herself the victim now, trying to redirect the conversation toward how she was being treated rather than what she'd actually done. But Uncle Tom didn't let her off the hook, and he said, "That's not an answer, Linda. It's a simple question." And my father was standing off to the side looking profoundly uncomfortable, his face flushed and his hands shoved in his pockets, and I could see him struggling with something, probably the realization that he'd thanked Linda for helping me less than an hour ago, that he'd participated in validating her lie without ever thinking to ask me directly about my own accomplishments, and Cousin Jenna suddenly straightened up like something had just clicked in her mind, and she said, "Wait, Linda, didn't you tell everyone last year that you helped me get my apartment in the city? That you knew someone at the rental company?" And her voice had a new edge to it. The edge of someone who was suddenly reevaluating past interactions in a new light. And Jenna continued, "But I got that apartment through a completely normal application process. I never understood what you meant about helping me, and I felt guilty for months that I hadn't thanked you properly." And I could see other cousins starting to think back through their own experiences with Linda, their faces showing recognition and dawning understanding. And then Marcus, my 16-year-old cousin, who'd been watching everything with those sharp, observant eyes, spoke up loudly enough that everyone could hear him clearly, and he said, "She does this with everything, though. Remember 2 years ago when she told everyone at Christmas that she got Aunt Carol's husband that job at the hospital, that she put in a good word with someone she knew on the board?" And several people turned to look at Aunt Carol, who was standing near the grill with her husband Frank, and Carol's expression shifted from confusion to something harder, and she said, "Linda had absolutely nothing to do with Frank's job. He got that position through a normal interview process after applying online. I never understood why Linda kept implying she'd helped." And her voice carried across the patio, and suddenly it was like a dam had broken, and multiple people were talking at once, sharing their own stories and experiences with Linda's credit claiming. And my cousin Beth mentioned something about Linda taking credit for a scholarship Beth had earned. and Uncle Richard brought up a business connection Linda had supposedly facilitated that turned out to have nothing to do with her. And the pattern was becoming visible to everyone simultaneously, like one of those optical illusions, where once you see it, you can't unsee it. And Linda's face had gone from red to pale to splotchy, and she was shaking her head and holding up her hands, and she said with her voice rising toward shrill, "You're all ganging up on me. You're all twisting everything I said. I was just trying to be supportive. I was just trying to help." But no one was buying it anymore. The spell had broken. And I stood there watching my family dynamic transform in real time, watching 17 years of careful narrative construction collapse in the space of 5 minutes. And I felt frozen and overwhelmed and strangely detached. Like I was watching this happen to someone else, and David was still standing nearby holding his corona and watching everything unfold with an expression that managed to be both satisfied and sympathetic. And my father finally moved, finally stepped forward, and he looked at Linda and then at me, and his face showed something I couldn't quite read, shame maybe, or recognition, or both. The conversation expanded outward from that central confrontation like ripples on water, and suddenly everyone was talking not quite over each other, but in overlapping waves of realization and confession. And Aunt Carol stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the grill and said in a voice that carried clearly, "Linda didn't have anything to do with Frank's job at the hospital. He went through 4 rounds of interviews over 6 weeks and got hired based on his 20 years of experience in hospital administration, and I never corrected her when she implied she'd helped, because I thought maybe she'd made some phone call I didn't know about, and I didn't want to seem ungrateful, but now I'm understanding she just made the whole thing up." And Frank nodded beside her, looking both validated and annoyed, and Uncle Tom set down his beer bottle with enough force that it made a sharp sound against the patio table, and he said, "Last year, Linda told my business partner that she'd connected us, that she'd introduced us at some charity event, and my partner seemed confused but went along with it, and I met James at a conference in Denver that Linda didn't even attend. And I brushed it off as Linda misremembering, but it wasn't misremembering, was it? It was just another lie." And his voice had real anger in it now, the kind of anger that comes from realizing you've been manipulated. And my cousin Beth, who was 24 and usually pretty quiet, spoke up and said, "When I got the Fulbright scholarship for my research in Tanzania, Linda told people at Thanksgiving that she'd helped me with my application essay, that she'd edited it and given me guidance. But I never showed her my essay. I never asked her for help. I worked with my faculty advisor for 3 months on that application." And Beth's voice was shaking slightly, like she was nervous about contradicting Linda publicly but determined to do it anyway. And I looked at Beth with a surge of recognition and gratitude because I'd never known Linda had done this to her too, had never realized the pattern extended to so many of us. And my grandmother was standing near the porch steps looking increasingly distressed, her hand pressed to her chest, and she kept looking at Linda and shaking her head with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and confusion. And Linda herself had backed up several steps and was standing near the sliding glass door with her back almost against the house, and her face had gone through red and white and was now settling into a blotchy combination of both, and she was shaking her head repeatedly and saying, "You're all misunderstanding. You're all taking things out of context. I never claimed to have done all these specific things. You're putting words in my mouth." But her voice had lost all its earlier confidence and warmth, and now just sounded desperate and cornered. And Uncle Richard, who was my father's brother and usually stayed out of family drama, entirely said, in his deep, measured voice, "Linda, I think it's time to stop talking." And it wasn't said cruelly, but it was absolutely final, and Linda looked at him with something like betrayal on her face. And then she turned that look on me, like this was somehow my fault, like I had orchestrated this public dismantling of her carefully constructed image, and she said with her voice rising and cracking, "I can't believe you're letting them do this to me, Maya. After everything I've done for you, after I stepped in when your mother died and tried to be there for you, this is how you repay me?" And she was crying now, real tears streaming down her face, but they felt manipulative rather than genuine. They felt like a last desperate attempt to regain sympathy and control. And I stood there watching her, and feeling a complicated tangle of emotions, guilt and anger and pity and relief all mixed together into something I couldn't quite name. And then Linda turned abruptly and stormed toward the sliding glass door, yanked it open hard enough that it bounced in its track, and disappeared into the house, and we could hear her footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor inside, and then the sound of the front door opening and slamming shut, and then the sound of a car engine starting in the driveway, and everyone stood there in the backyard listening to Linda drive away. And the silence that followed her departure was different from all the earlier silences. It was lighter somehow, less pressured, like a storm had passed. The silence after Linda's departure stretched for maybe 10 seconds before people started moving and talking again in quiet, uncertain voices, and I stood there feeling like I'd just witnessed a car accident, emotionally overwhelmed and not quite sure what I was supposed to do or say next. And then my father detached himself from where he'd been standing near the picnic table and walked toward me with his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look older than his 54 years. And he stopped in front of me and looked at me directly in a way he actually hadn't done in longer than I could remember. And his eyes were red-rimmed and his voice was rough when he said, "Maya, I'm sorry, I should have seen it. I should have stood up for you." And the apology hung there between us, weighted with 17 years of him not standing up for me, 17 years of him accepting Linda's narratives without question and praising her for helping me when she'd done nothing. And I looked at my father and felt a complicated knot of emotions that I couldn't untangle in that moment. Anger and grief and a small, fragile hope all mixed together. And I nodded because I wasn't ready to say it's okay when it wasn't okay, when his apology was inadequate against the years of erasure and invisibility. But I also wasn't ready to reject the apology entirely because it was something. It was at least an acknowledgement that things had been wrong. And my father seemed to understand that my nod was all he was going to get right now, because he nodded back and squeezed my shoulder briefly before stepping away. And I was grateful he didn't push for more or try to make me comfort him about his own guilt. And David was still standing a few feet away near the patio table, giving me space, but clearly present if I needed him. And his quiet, steady presence felt like an anchor in the chaos of everything that had just happened. And then my grandmother appeared at my elbow, and she was crying, actual tears running down her weathered cheeks. And she took my hand in both of hers, and her hands were soft and papery and trembling slightly, and she said, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. I'm so proud of everything you've accomplished. And I'm sorry I believed Linda's stories without ever asking you directly about your own life and your own work." And her voice cracked on the last words, and I felt my own eyes filling with tears, because my grandmother's opinion had always mattered to me. She'd been the one stable, loving presence after my mother died, and hearing her express pride in my actual accomplishments rather than Linda's fabricated version meant more than I could articulate. And I squeezed her hands and said, "Thank you, Grandma," in a voice that came out thick with emotion. And she pulled me into a hug that smelled like her lavender perfume and fabric softener. And when we separated, I noticed that the atmosphere of the BBQ had shifted entirely, the tension and shock of the confrontation giving way to something different, something that felt almost like curiosity and genuine interest. And people were gravitating toward me not with pity or awkwardness, but with what seemed like real desire to understand who I actually was and what I actually did. And Aunt Carol approached with her husband Frank and asked if I'd be willing to tell them about my actual job, because she realized she had no idea what a regional director did or what my work actually involved. And Uncle Tom joined us and said he'd always wondered about my career path, but Linda had always dominated conversations about me, so he'd never gotten to ask directly. And Cousin Jenna appeared with a fresh drink for me, a gin and tonic that I accepted gratefully, and she said quietly, "I'm sorry I didn't question Linda's story sooner. I think part of me knew something was off, but it was easier to go along with it." And I appreciated her honesty and told her so. I found myself actually telling my story for the first time, really telling it without minimization or deflection. Standing there in my father's backyard with a gin and tonic in my hand and a small circle of family members gathered around me, asking genuine questions and listening to the actual answers. And it felt strange and vulnerable and oddly liberating all at once, and I started with the basics, explaining that I'd been with TechCore Industries for 6 years, starting as a junior analyst in their supply chain division right out of college. And Uncle Tom asked what supply chain management actually meant because he'd heard the term but never really understood it. And I explained that it was essentially managing the flow of products and materials from suppliers through manufacturing to customers, optimizing every step to reduce costs and improve efficiency. And I could see real interest in his eyes as I talked. And Cousin Jenna asked how I'd gotten promoted from analyst to regional director in 6 years, which seemed fast. And I felt myself wanting to downplay it the way I always had, wanting to say I'd just gotten lucky or been in the right place at the right time. But I caught David's eye from where he stood near the porch, and he gave me an encouraging nod. And so instead, I told the truth. I said, I worked incredibly hard, and I was good at my job. I identified inefficiencies that other people missed, and I wasn't afraid to propose solutions that challenged existing processes. And I told them about the supply chain optimization project that David had mentioned, how I'd spent 9 months analyzing our distribution network across the Southeast region and had identified a way to consolidate 3 warehouses into 2 strategically located facilities while actually improving delivery times, and how I'd built detailed financial models and created presentations for the executive team and had faced significant resistance from managers who'd been doing things the same way for 20 years. And how I'd persisted because I knew the data supported my recommendations, and Uncle Tom was nodding and asking smart questions about the logistics. And Marcus had moved closer and was listening with intense focus, and he asked, "Did people try to take credit for your project?" And his question was so perceptive and direct that it caught me off guard, and I paused and then said honestly, yes, my direct supervisor at the time tried to present my work as a collaborative effort that he'd overseen when really he'd been skeptical of it from the beginning. But I'd documented everything, and when the VP of Operations asked me directly about the methodology, I was able to speak to every detail because it was entirely my work. And Marcus nodded with satisfaction, like this confirmed something he'd been thinking. And Jenna asked about my education, whether I'd always planned to go into business. And I explained that I'd actually started college as an engineering major, but had switched to business administration with a concentration in operations management during my sophomore year, and that I'd graduated summa cum laude, which I added quietly, because even now saying it felt like bragging. And my grandmother, who'd been standing nearby listening, interjected and said, "Why are you saying it quietly? You should say it proudly. You earned those honors." And her words hit me with unexpected force, because she was right. I had earned them. I'd worked 2 part-time jobs and studied until 2 in the morning and sacrificed my social life and pushed through exhaustion and self-doubt. And nobody had given me that GPA or that degree. I had earned every bit of it myself. And I felt tears prickling at my eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of hurt or frustration, but something closer to relief. And Beth came over and asked about the financial impact of my projects and whether I'd done other major initiatives beyond the warehouse consolidation. And I found myself describing 2 other significant projects I'd led. One that had streamlined our vendor management process and saved approximately $800,000 annually, and another that had improved our inventory forecasting accuracy by 37%. And as I talked, I could see David smiling from his position by the porch, and my father was standing within earshot looking simultaneously proud and pained. And I realized that this was the first time most of these people were hearing any real details about my career, the first time I was being seen as I actually was, rather than as Linda's charity case or lucky beneficiary. I was still talking with Uncle Tom about the logistics of the warehouse consolidation project when I saw movement near the sliding glass door that led into the house, and my stomach dropped because Linda was coming back outside, and the animated conversation I'd been having faltered as people noticed her reappearance, and the circle around me went quiet in that awkward way that happens when someone who's just been exposed returns to the scene, And Linda walked across the patio with her purse over her shoulder, like she might be leaving. But then she stopped a few feet away from where I stood and looked at me with an expression that I couldn't quite read, something between defiance and misery. And she said, "Maya, I need to talk to you." And her voice was thick like she'd been crying. And I felt everyone watching us, and I didn't particularly want to have this conversation, but I also knew it needed to happen, so I nodded and said, "Okay." And Linda glanced around at the family members still gathered near me and said, "Maybe we could talk privately?" And I almost agreed out of habit, almost followed her away from the group to have whatever conversation she wanted to have in private where there would be no witnesses and where the family dynamics could slip back into their old patterns. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the empowerment of having just told my actual story for the first time. Or maybe it was David's presence reminding me that I didn't have to accept treatment that diminished me. Or maybe it was just 17 years of exhaustion finally reaching a breaking point, and I said, "No, I think we can talk here." And I saw surprise flash across Linda's face, followed by something that looked like panic, but she recovered and nodded and took a breath, and she said, "I want to apologize. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I just wanted to feel like I mattered, like I'd contributed something to your success." And I waited because I could feel there was more coming. And sure enough, she continued, her voice getting stronger and taking on that familiar tone of justification that I'd heard so many times before. "I did help raise you after your mother died. I was there for you when you needed a woman's guidance. I took you shopping for your first formal dress. I helped you move into your college dorm. I gave you advice about jobs and relationships, and I never asked for anything in return. I never expected gratitude. But I think I deserve some recognition for being there for you all those years." And as she spoke, I felt the familiar pull of guilt that she'd always been so skilled at creating. The sense that maybe I was being ungrateful, maybe I was minimizing her contributions, maybe I owed her something after all. But then I looked at her words more carefully, and I realized what she was doing. She was apologizing, but not really. She was saying sorry, but then immediately justifying her behavior and reframing it as something I should actually be grateful for. And she was claiming credit again, even in her apology, claiming that she'd raised me when the reality was so much more complicated than that. And I felt anger rising in my chest, clean and clarifying anger that burned away the guilt. And I looked at Linda, and I saw her clearly, maybe for the first time. I saw her need for importance and recognition. I saw her insecurity that drove her to steal other people's accomplishments. I saw her patterns of manipulation that had shaped my entire adult life. And I also saw that she wasn't going to change unless someone made her change, unless someone held up a mirror and forced her to see what she was doing. And I realized that someone had to be me, and I took a breath and said, "Linda, I need you to stop." And my voice came out steadier than I expected, and she looked at me with confusion and said, "Stop what?" And I said, "Stop rewriting history. Stop claiming credit for things you didn't do. Stop making my accomplishments about you." And I saw her face start to harden defensively, but I kept going. "You were present in my life after my mother died. That's true. You took me shopping a few times and you helped me move into my dorm, and I appreciate those things. But that doesn't give you the right to claim you raised me, or that you're responsible for my education or my career or my success." And Linda opened her mouth to interrupt, but I held up my hand and continued. "You didn't tutor me through college. I earned my degree myself while working 2 jobs. You didn't help me get my first internship. I applied to 47 companies and got that position based on my own interview. You didn't make calls to get me promoted. I earned that promotion through 6 years of exceptional work performance. And you need to stop telling people that you did those things because it's not true and it's harmful to me." Linda's face had gone from defensive to pale, and I watched her process what I'd just said. And there was a long moment of silence where the entire family seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And I knew this was the critical moment, that if I didn't follow through now with clear boundaries, then nothing would actually change, and we'd slip back into the same patterns within weeks or months. And so I took another breath and continued. Moving forward, I need you to stop claiming credit for my accomplishments. I need you to stop telling people that you helped me in ways that you didn't. And I need you to be honest about what role you actually played in my life, which was occasional aunt, not mother figure or benefactor or career mentor. And Linda's eyes were filling with tears and she said, Maya, you're being so harsh. I made mistakes, but I was trying to help. And I felt the familiar pull of guilt again, the urge to soften my words and make her feel better and minimize my own needs. But I pushed through it and said, I'm not trying to be harsh, I'm trying to be clear, and I'm setting a boundary that should have been set years ago. And I paused, and then added what I knew had to be said. If you can't respect this boundary, if you continue to take credit for things you didn't do, or tell people stories that aren't true about your role in my success, then I'm going to have to distance myself from family gatherings where you're present. And I don't want to do that, but I will if I need to. And I heard a few small gasps from family members. Because this was concrete. This was a real consequence. This wasn't just emotional processing, but an actual ultimatum. And Linda looked around as if seeking support but found none. And my father, who had been standing slightly behind me, stepped forward and said, Linda, I think Maya's being more than fair. I think you need to agree to what she's asking. And his support in this moment meant more than I could fully process. It was 17 years too late, but it was something, and Uncle Tom nodded and said, Yeah, Linda, this has gone on long enough. We've all seen the pattern now, and it needs to stop. And Beth was nodding too, and Cousin Jenna said quietly but firmly, You should apologize for real, Aunt Linda. Not the kind of apology where you justify everything right after. And Linda looked cornered and exposed, and I almost felt sorry for her because I could see how much she needed the recognition she'd been stealing from me. I could see that it came from some deep insecurity or need in her own life. But I also knew that her needs didn't excuse her behavior, and that feeling sorry for her had kept me silent for too long already. And Linda's tears were flowing now, and she said, Fine, fine, I won't talk about your career anymore. I won't mention anything about helping you. Is that what you want? And her tone was bitter and hurt, and I said, I want you to be honest. That's all. You can talk about our relationship, but it needs to be truthful. You can say you were present in my life after my mother died, but you can't claim you raised me or paid for my education or got me jobs. Those things aren't true, and you know they aren't true. And Linda wiped her eyes and nodded stiffly and said, I need to go. And she looked at my father and said, I'll talk to you later. And then she turned and walked toward the driveway, her purse still over her shoulder, and I watched her go, feeling exhausted and sad and relieved all at once, and nobody tried to stop her, and I heard her car start a minute later, and then the sound of her driving away, and the backyard was quiet for a moment, and then gradually conversation started up again, tentative at first, and then more normal, and I realized that the gathering was continuing without her, that the family was making a choice in this moment about whose behavior was acceptable and whose wasn't. And I felt my father's hand on my shoulder, and he said quietly, I'm proud of you. That took courage. And I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. And gradually people drifted back into smaller conversations, and the atmosphere of the BBQ shifted. It became lighter somehow, less constrained, as if Linda's departure had released some pressure that had been building for years. The evening was settling into that golden hour quality, where the sun hung low and cast long shadows across the backyard, and people had started gathering their plates and empty bottles, making those subtle movements that signal a gathering is beginning to wind down, but hasn't quite ended yet. And I was standing near the food table helping Aunt Beth cover the leftover potato salad when I felt someone approach from my left, and I turned to see David holding his empty beer bottle and looking slightly apologetic, and he said, Maya, do you have a minute? And I nodded immediately and said, Of course. And we walked together toward the quieter corner of the yard near my father's shed, where the noise of conversation was more distant, and we could actually hear ourselves think. And when we stopped, David turned to me and said, I hope I didn't overstep back there. I know family dynamics are complicated, and I'm an outsider. And I felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost knocked me over, and I said, David, you have no idea what you did for me. I've been living with that pattern for 17 years, and I never knew how to break it. And he smiled and said, I figured as much. You're too accomplished to actually need the kind of help your aunt was claiming to provide. And I laughed, a real laugh that felt good after all the tension, and I said, I should ask though, why did you actually come today? I know my invitation was pretty casual and I honestly didn't think you'd show up. And David's expression became more serious, and he said, I came because you're the best regional director I have, and I wanted to meet the family who raised someone that capable, and also because in our one-on-one last month, you mentioned feeling underestimated by your family, and I was curious about that. And I remembered that conversation, a moment of vulnerability during a performance review, when David had asked about my leadership confidence, and I'd admitted that building confidence had been a lifelong challenge. And he continued, when I got here and heard what your aunt was saying, I understood immediately what you'd been dealing with, and I couldn't stay silent because I won't let my best people be diminished. Not at work, and not anywhere else if I can help it. And his words settled into me with a weight that felt permanent. This idea that someone in authority saw my worth and was willing to defend it. And I said, thank you. That means more than I can really express. And David nodded, and then he said something that surprised me. My father never thought I'd amount to anything. He was a surgeon and he expected me to go to medical school. And when I went into business instead, he basically wrote me off as a failure, and it took me until I was almost 40 to stop seeking his approval and just own my accomplishments. And he paused and then continued. I see some of that in you, Maya, this hesitation to claim what you've earned, and I want you to work on that. Not just with your family, but at work too. You should be talking about your wins in leadership meetings. You should be visible about your successes. You've earned that visibility. And I absorbed his words, knowing he was right. Knowing that my reluctance to speak up about my achievements came from the same place as my years of silence with Linda. This fear that claiming my accomplishments was somehow arrogant or inappropriate, and I said, I'll work on that, I promise. And David smiled and said, Good, because I'm grooming you for VP track and you'll need that confidence. And my eyes widened because he'd never mentioned VP track before. And he saw my reaction and laughed and said, Yeah, that's the kind of thing you should be excited about and talking about, not hiding. And we stood there for another moment in comfortable silence, and then David said, I should probably get going. I've got a flight to Chicago early tomorrow. And I walked him toward the side gate where he'd parked, and before he left, he shook my hand formally and said, Congratulations again on the promotion, Maya. You earned every bit of it. And then he was gone. And I stood there in the driveway feeling like something fundamental had shifted, not just in my family relationships, but in how I saw myself. I walked back toward the main gathering area, feeling like the world had tilted slightly on its axis, like something fundamental had rearranged itself in a way that couldn't be undone. And as I rejoined the family, I noticed that the sun was getting lower, and the light had turned that particular shade of amber that signals early evening, and people were starting the slow process of wrapping up the gathering, covering dishes with foil, and gathering their belongings while still maintaining conversations. And I found myself gravitating toward Cousin Jenna, who was stacking paper plates near the food table, and when she saw me, she smiled and said, That was intense, but I'm really glad it happened. I've been wondering about some of Aunt Linda's stories for years, but I never knew how to ask. And I helped her with the plates and said, I should have said something a long time ago. And she shook her head and said, It's not your responsibility to correct her lies, Maya. That's on her. And her words were simple, but they settled into me with a clarity that felt important. This idea that I hadn't been wrong for staying silent, that the wrongness belonged entirely to Linda. And Marcus wandered over holding a garbage bag and started collecting empty bottles. And he looked at me with that direct way that teenagers have and said, So you basically built your whole career by yourself while Aunt Linda took credit for everything? And I nodded and said, Pretty much, yeah. And he said, That's actually really impressive. Like, I knew you had some corporate job, but I didn't know you were managing hundreds of people and saving millions of dollars. And I smiled because his awe was genuine and uncomplicated. And I said, "What about you, Marcus? What are you thinking about for after high school?" And his face lit up, and he started telling me about his interest in software development and his worry that he wasn't good enough for the competitive programs. And I listened, really listened. And then I said, "How about this? I work with a lot of tech teams, and I know people in the industry. Why don't we set up a time to talk about your options, and I can introduce you to some contacts if you're serious about pursuing it?" And his eyes widened and he said, "Really? That would be amazing." And Jenna said, "See, that's actual mentorship, not whatever Linda was pretending to do." And the three of us continued cleaning up together, and I realized this was what family was supposed to feel like, this easy collaboration and genuine interest in each other's lives. And my father came over and asked if we needed help, and we put him to work folding up chairs. And gradually the remaining guests said their goodbyes, and the backyard emptied until it was just the core family. And my grandmother hugged me before she left and whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't see it before, honey. I'm so proud of who you've become." And her words brought tears to my eyes because I'd wanted her recognition for so long. And after she left, I stood in the backyard with my father and Jenna and Marcus and Aunt Beth, and we finished the cleanup in comfortable near silence. And when everything was put away, my father walked me to my car and said, "Linda called me. She's very upset." And I nodded and said, "I'm sure she is. But Dad, those boundaries need to stay in place. This can't go back to how it was." And he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I know, and they will. I promise I'll support you on this." And I got into my car and drove home through the twilight streets, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Maybe lighter than I'd ever felt, because the weight I'd been carrying wasn't just Linda's lies, but my own silence, my own inability to claim my worth. And that silence had been broken today, not just by David's intervention, but by my own voice, finally speaking the truth. And as I pulled into my apartment parking lot, I thought about everything that had happened, the confrontation and the exposure and the boundary setting, and I realized that the validation I'd been seeking my whole life hadn't come from Linda finally acknowledging what she'd done or from my family's recognition, though both of those things mattered. But the real validation had come from standing in my own truth, from finally saying out loud that I had accomplished extraordinary things entirely on my own merit. And I carried that knowledge with me as I walked up the stairs to my apartment, this sense that I was finally, fully, standing in my own life without apologizing for taking up space or achieving success. And I knew that Monday morning, I would walk into Tech Core Industries as regional director, and I would speak up in meetings about my wins, and I would claim visibility for my successes. And I would mentor Marcus and maybe other young people who needed someone to believe in them. And I would continue to hold the boundary with Linda, even when it was uncomfortable. And most importantly, I would keep speaking my truth, even when it felt easier to stay silent. Because I had learned today that silence had cost me 17 years of authentic connection with my family and countless opportunities to own my achievements. And I wasn't willing to pay that price anymore. And as I unlocked my door and stepped into my quiet apartment, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced since before my mother died. This feeling that I was finally, actually, genuinely myself.